Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I hope you're all doing well. SPFBO8 is nearly finished. We will know the winner of this year's competition very shortly. And because I've now finished reading all 10 of the finalists, I thought it would be a good time to go and recap my experience of this year's final. So I thought there's two different ways that I could do this, two ways that I could look at my experience and kind of quantify it, if you like. First of all, in a moment, I'll go through the predictions that I made several months ago when I found out the 10 books that were going to be in the SPFBO8 final and decided that I was going to read them all as part of Cassidy's Alternate SPFBO final. For that kind of collaboration, Cassidy set up a rubric to score each book in several different areas: enjoyment, writing style, characters, world building and so forth, which is similar to what I do myself anyway in my weighted ratings. So I'll go through my essentially rankings of the 10 books in both of those systems. So on the one hand, we'll have Cassidy's rubric, which scores everything out of 10, and then on the other hand, we'll have my traditional weighted ratings, where I do score different categories out of different totals. So for the overall enjoyment, the characters, the world building and the plot, I score out of 20. The writing style, I score out of 10. I then score the pacing out of 5, and there's an additional 5 points left over to give me a total of 100%, and I use that for discretionary scores for things like covers and internal artwork, additional extras with the book and so forth. So before the final, I'd already read 3 of these books. I read A Touch of Light by Thiago Abdallah first. Next I read Fire of the Forebears by LA Book as part of my official involvement in SPFBO8 because I was one of the initial judges for Team Bookborn. Then I read The 13th Hour by Trudy Skies, and shortly after I finished that one, I accepted an invitation from Cassidy to read the remaining 7 and provide scores in her rubric as part of her alternate final. So when I did my predictions, I went through all 10 of them, I read the synopses, I tried as hard as I could to be impartial, to forget my experience of reading the 3 books that I already had read, and just base my predictions on the synopses, how I thought the books would sit with me, what my overall enjoyment would be, which is very difficult because obviously you don't know, but also having read 3 of those books, although I was trying to be impartial, it is difficult because I do know more than just what's in the synopses. So first of all, these are the rankings that I predicted from the 10 finalists. First of all is the book that I read and put into the semi-final that Bookborn then picked as her finalist. I predicted my number 1 book would be Fire of the Forebears by LA Book. Next up was The Umbral Storm by Alec Hudson. Then there was Tethered Spirits by T.A. Hernandez, A Touch of Light by Thiago Abdallah, and Mysterious Ways by Abby Evans. Then we had The 13th Hour by Trudy Skies, Miss Percy's Pocket Guide to the Care and Feeding of British Dragons by Quenby Olson, A Song for the Void by Andrew C. Piazza, Scales and Sensibility by Stephanie Burgess, and at the bottom, the one that I predicted I would like the least was Small Miracles by Olivia Atwater. So this was very difficult for me to predict because there's a lot of these books that aren't really ones that I would pick up normally. They're not my normal taste. So I wasn't really looking forward to reading them all because there was no DNFing allowed. We were going to read all 10 of these whether we liked them or not. So I was starting off with maybe a bit of a handicap, and it did mean that this final wasn't the best reading experience for me. I didn't get a lot of enjoyment out of it, and I will be honest, the books that I enjoyed the most I'd probably already read before deciding to read all of the finalists. So yes, I did regret my decision to say yes on numerous occasions as I was reading these books that quite frankly just weren't to my normal reading tastes. I did find it a little bit interesting to see the changes between the 2 lists I've got because the rubric that Cassidy set up and my weighted ratings do judge similar things, but obviously the weightings that I apply to certain categories will mean that the overall scores can be quite different depending on what's scoring well and what's not scoring so well. There were some books that were at the top of both and some books that were at the bottom of both, and that's to be expected, but in between there was a little bit of movement. I was considering also looking at my overall enjoyment using the rating that I gave those in my weighted ratings, but they did tie in very closely to Cassidy's rubric and the overall ranking on there, so I thought it wasn't necessary to do that because there weren't really enough differences to make it worthwhile. I will go through Cassidy's rubric first, and I haven't written down the scores I gave for these ones. I'm not sure why, but there we go. But I did end up going with Fire of the Forebears at the top of this pile. The second highest scoring book that I had here was A Touch of Light, and then Tethered Spirits rounded out the top three. In equal fourth, I had a tie between The 13th Hour and The Umbral Storm, and then in sixth place, one of the big surprises perhaps, was A Song for the Void. I then had Mysterious Ways, Scales and Sensibility, and at the bottom I ended up with Small Miracles ahead of Miss Percy in 10th. So with this one I did say that A Song for the Void was a bit of a surprise. I didn't really enjoy reading this book because it's not really a fantasy book. I still, whenever I talk about it, I will always say that I struggle to understand how it's in the competition, or at least how it's become a finalist of a fantasy competition, bearing in mind that I don't think it's fantasy at all. It's cosmic horror, as the author says so himself. But the writing in here was pretty good. I was able to read it all the way through. Although it's not my normal genre in any sense of the term, I didn't have necessarily a bad time with it, other than the fact that I was reading it because essentially I had to, or I'd committed myself to reading it, rather than because at any point I wanted to read it. It was an okay story despite everything else. The characters I thought were actually alright as well. The world building did suffer, and this is the case with several of these books because they are set in our world. So for me, I look at actual world building, and there wasn't too much building to be done, so that definitely does come into play with some of these. But overall, I think this book kind of towed the middle line. It didn't go too far one way or the other for me, and there were a couple of books below it that I just really didn't enjoy for one reason or another. And I think my taste in fantasy definitely does come through here, because looking at the rankings that I have here, the top 5 are all set in a secondary world, and the bottom 5 are all set in our world. And I do always say that for fantasy, I don't want our world as a setting, I want a secondary world. And certainly when we're scoring world building, that's definitely part of the reason why these 5 books are in the bottom half of the table. But my overall enjoyment of them is definitely spurred on by that setting. But there are, of course, other things that come into it as well. So with these, the writing style was one of the big ones for me, and the bottom 2 that I've got here, I had issues with the writing in both of them. It just didn't work for me whatsoever. Small Miracles, I just didn't get into at all. I felt like it was someone trying to emulate Terry Pratchett's writing style, while also trying to emulate the kind of tone and setting and themes of Bridget Jones's Diary. And I like Terry Pratchett, I've read a lot of the Discworld books, and I don't mind Bridget Jones's Diary, or at least the film, not the book, so I haven't read the book, but it didn't work as a combination for me. It doesn't appeal to me whatsoever, and that definitely hampered this book for me. With Miss Percy, I was finding the text to be broken up all the time, but instead of footnotes like it was in Small Miracles, here we had parentheses. Every other paragraph seemed to have an aside set in brackets, and I just couldn't get a good flow as I was reading through this book. At the top end of the scale, well, it's the secondary world fantasies, so I'm not really surprised there. Probably the one that I am the most surprised by is The Umbral Storm, because I didn't really have a great time with this one. I couldn't get into the story. It started off for me very slow, and then I couldn't get over that hurdle as I was going through the book. It kind of shot itself in the foot early on, and there wasn't enough healing done throughout the rest of the book. I thought Mysterious Ways might score a bit higher, and I did make a mistake because this one is in the bottom 5 and it's a secondary world, but in many ways it didn't feel like a secondary world. It felt like it was just a regular world with names changed, and it just didn't work for me. It had angels and demons as the main kind of fantasy elements really, and it just didn't do anything for me whatsoever. If we move on to my weighted ratings, I think this one is, for me at least, more surprising. At the top, once again, we had Fire of the Forebears, which I scored 82% on my weighted ratings because I had a great time reading this. I just really enjoyed it. And the world building I loved in this book. It scored really highly in that respect. And then one of the big surprises is my second place book here, which was actually The 13th Hour, and again it's the world building that did well here. It actually scored the highest world building score of all of these finalists in my weighted ratings, and overall this one ended up with 76%. Just below that on 75% we had A Touch of Light, and then we've got another 2 books that finished up very close, with Tethered Spirits on 73% and The Umbral Storm on 72%. Going down a few percent now, we've got Scales and Sensibility came next with 67%. helped by a really fluid writing style that scored highly in my weighted ratings. And then 1 point below that at 66, we've got Song for the Void. Mysterious Ways was a little bit further below with 62%, and then I've got the same bottom two as in the other rating, and they are in the same order, with Small Miracle scoring 47 and Miss Percy scoring 46. And once again, for both of those, it was a writing style that really hampered their overall scores, but I didn't see enough in the rest of the book for either of them to score highly in other categories and move the book up for ratings. Again, I'm probably surprised by how highly, comparatively, A Song for the Void scored, but probably a bigger surprise for me in the bottom half of this was Scales and Sensibility, but the writing style being really good, it helped that everything else was just okay, and it did help this one to get a pretty decent score for a book that, ultimately, I didn't really enjoy that much. So again, no surprise really to see that the secondary world settings are the ones pretty much taking up the top few spaces here. But as I said, the 13th Hour pulling out second spot for me was a surprise because I didn't enjoy the book that much. It didn't quite work for me for a number of reasons. However, the world building was really, really good. So the top two books that I have here, Fire of the Forebears and the 13th Hour, are the two that had the best world building, both very, very different, but both very imaginative and very well done. So although there were a few surprises overall, and there were a few that definitely didn't surprise where they ended up compared to my original predictions, I think the main takeaway for me from this is that I do have a pretty good grasp of what my own reading tastes are, and sadly for me, many of the books in this final didn't come close to my reading tastes. So there were some books that from the start probably were handicapped because I was going into them not really expecting to enjoy them. I tried to read them all with an open mind, and I did have, in a sense, a surprise with how easy reading some of them were, and a lot of that was tied down to the enjoyment of them. But also it shows for me that you can't be a winner just by throwing a dragon in there in a regular setting, and if you've got a fantasy setting and you've not really got the high fantastical elements, it can work. There are some books that do that really well, but the angels and demons aspect of it is another one that just really doesn't work for me. So in one sense, I think disappointment is my main kind of feeling about this final, but on the other hand, I don't think I was really expecting too much, so am I disappointed, or have I just hit my expectations of what I was going to read here? There are definitely some good books here, and people who've got a wider reading taste than me will find something in here that they'll enjoy, I'm certain of that. Obviously, the judges have had a great experience with many of these books, and my tastes are just very far away from where their heads are at this moment in time, at least. I have had a few conversations on Discord about this, and it seems very strange comparing the SPFBO7 and the SPFBO8 finalists because they are two completely different sets of books. There seems to have been a bit of a shift in this final. I'm not sure whether it's down to the books that have been entered into the competition in the first place, or whether it's a case of the judges just looking for something else, whether there's a bit of fatigue about certain types of books in there. I don't know, but it is definitely a bit of a strange one when you compare the final 10 last year to the final 10 this year. With all that said though, there is a new competition starting up soon. SPFBO9 will be opening its doors in mid-May. So if you're a self-published fantasy author and you want to join the next competition, keep your eye out on Mark Lawrence's blog. I'll leave a link in the box below this video for that. And despite not having a great experience with the final here, I am still very excited to look at what's going to be in the new competition, check out all of the covers, start making some predictions, see how many books I'll recognise and how many new books I'm going to add to my list that I want to check out. So that's everything for today. I just wanted a quick look at where I finished against where I predicted I would finish and see if there were any real big takeaways or surprises from that. I don't think there were really in this one, but we'll see what happens with next year's competition. If you've read any of this year's finalists, let me know your thoughts on them down below, or if there's any books that didn't make it to the final that you think could have had a really good chance. I'll hopefully catch you in the next video sometime soon, but until then, as always, take care of yourselves, read some good books. Bye for now.